Hi, everybody. Let's make a start. Nice to see you all, and greetings from Italy. I'm actually in the island of Sardinia, in the middle of the Mediterranean. So greetings to another group of islands, also in the middle of a beautiful blue sea. My name is Richard Norton, and I'm Director of Security Studies at the Oxford Cyber Academy. By studying the cybersecurity course, you'll have seen that digital transformation is having an incredible impact on all of us every day. Alongside all the positives, you've also studied the challenges that it brings with it. And I'm going to go through some of the reasons that make cybersecurity so hard. I'm aiming to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, but after that, let's see if we can get a conversation going with all of you. And a subject of particular interest could be, for example, to explore how smaller states can manage the cyber threats that are coming at us thick and fast. So let me start by saying, what is the cyber challenge? In just 20 years, we've already seen some incredible digital developments. Looking ahead, the Google boss Sundar Pichai argued in a BBC interview last week that artificial intelligence, AI, is the most profound technology that humanity will ever develop. He said it's like fire or electricity or the internet, but even more profound. He then went on to say that the free and open internet is under attack all around the world. And I think that this reflects the critical challenge at the heart of cybersecurity. On the one hand, we're more and more dependent on digital technology. It's embedded deeper and deeper into every aspect of our societies. On the other hand, hackers are doing everything they can to corrupt, control, and steal through the internet. It's what I call the digital arms race. The good guys are putting huge effort into digital innovation that promises fantastic benefits to us as individuals and to the whole human race. Meanwhile, the bad guys are working at least as hard to exploit that innovation for their own purposes. So here's my exam question. Why is cybersecurity so hard? I'm going to talk about three factors that combine, I think, to make managing cybersecurity risk really difficult. You'll see on the slide: technology, psychology, the human factor, and politics, which is principally an international factor. And then, as I said, if you're interested, we can get into a discussion about what all of this means. So let's start by looking at 5 key features of technology in the digital world, and we'll see each of them has serious implications for managing security risk. The first one is scale. Nobody knows how many digital devices there are in the world. Apple alone have produced 2.2 billion iPhones since their launch in 2007. And last year, in just the 1 year 2020, Samsung sold 253 million smartphones. And of course, that's only one part of the digital device market. If you add on tablets, PCs, notebooks, fitness trackers, TVs, and all the rest, we're talking about tens of billions of individual devices. And that scale brings complexity. These billions of devices are communicating through vast global networks that expose what are called in security jargon extensive attack surfaces. That just means a huge number of places where a hacker can break in. Security people like me always hate complexity. We like to keep things simple. That's just not possible in our new cyber world. Speed is the next great challenge for security types. Quite simply, it's really difficult to keep up as new technologies pour onto the market at breakneck speed. And there's a further complication. The people who develop and sell digital technology are running businesses, of course. Their focus is on their bottom line and the rush to market, as it's called. This can work against innovation in security. Manufacturers and vendors often prefer to stick with tried and trusted old solutions. They're much cheaper than developing a new solution designed from scratch. Impact is a big concern because in our new digital world, there's no longer any barrier between the digital, the physical, and the biological worlds. Well, what does that mean? Think of the major companies that provide electricity or water. Their services work through digital industrial control systems. These companies may already be high on hackers' target lists. Knock out electrical production, for example, and there could be physical consequences on other networks that rely on electricity. In worst cases, there could be a catastrophic impact on daily life and on the environment. On the human level, people could die or even be seriously injured. That's a really scary prospect, and I'll talk more about it in a moment. And finally, modern business models based on digital innovation have radically changed how we all work. But they've also had a significant impact on cybersecurity. An obvious example, even before the COVID pandemic, millions of people around the world were already working away from their offices. Digital transformation had given them 24/7 access to their organization's data and made that business model possible. And that new model was incredibly important when COVID forced us into lockdowns. Many developed economies would have stopped if their workers were sent home with no access to their offices' networks. But at the same time, security became much more difficult to enforce. To take just one example, many people started to use their own devices and home Wi-Fi instead of properly protected office equipment and networks. So 5 different technology factors make life really difficult for security. Put them all together, and security managers are facing major challenges. What sort of challenges am I talking about? Well, this slide gives you some idea of how complicated it can look. Law enforcement agencies have seen more organized crime in the last 12 months than in several previous years combined. Ransomware incidents alone have risen by more than 60%, with increasing attacks on targets that promise high impact and big profits. And there's a great business model for the hackers. They don't have to invest much. You can buy the hacking tools very cheaply on the dark web. They make huge profits, and their chances of being caught are almost non-existent. We can see already that the characteristics of the technology itself often work against us. But what about the people who use the technology? And that brings me to my second theme, psychology, and what's known as the human risk factor. A common estimate is that human error causes around 80 to 90% of cybersecurity incidents. Hackers know that using psychology by targeting human fallibility works extremely well. We can see that over the last 18 months in the huge surge in phishing attacks, for example, that are specifically designed to trick people. So the good guys also need to brush up their psychological approach and to educate employees away from behaviors that are risky, careless, or frankly, just plain stupid. In fact, a lot of behavioral psychologists are working on human risk management. To take one example, they're looking at how we can nudge people to do the right thing when they're online. They talk in particular about so-called soft and hard constraints. I saw a nice example of a soft nudge recently. It's being trialed in the UK government to encourage people to lock their computers when they leave their desks. A sensor on the laptop notices when you move away from your PC. It makes the screen flash red. It's just a soft nudge to say, are you really sure you want to leave your PC unlocked? And of course, it's something that other people in the office will see, and they can also remind your colleagues to do the right thing. That's an example of a positive nudge, but many businesses still prefer a more traditional approach by naming and shaming staff who make mistakes. I haven't got time to go into this now, but companies that take this approach, I think, need to be careful because there is important general questions around the concepts of belonging and trust that I think are fundamental to a positive security culture. As I said just now, it's been much more difficult during the pandemic to encourage secure behaviours when staff are working from home. There are particular issues with embedding company culture, including good security practice in new hires, for example. Meanwhile, a lot of staff have had the constant distraction of managing family responsibilities alongside their work. And finally, it's clear that isolation, overload, and lack of personal contact with colleagues can cause stress and depression. In fact, a Gartner survey in March found that employees' need for well-being support has skyrocketed since the start of the pandemic. Psychology matters to security here too. Anybody whose mind isn't fully on their job is a security risk. In the online world, even a momentary lapse of concentration can have big consequences. So I've talked about technology and psychology, two factors that combine to make cybersecurity really difficult. Let me end with some comments on politics. I mentioned earlier that hackers have very little chance of getting caught and punished for their activities. One obvious reason is that they don't have to worry about international frontiers and multiple jurisdictions. On the internet, the world is truly global. So that raises the obvious question: what is the international community doing to crack down on the hackers? Well, like everything to do with cybersecurity, it's complicated. One of the main complications is that individual nation states are very busy hacking each other. Apart from targeting government departments, they're attacking the companies that are running critical national infrastructure. They're also going after any organization in any sector that contains potentially useful data and intellectual property. That means they're looking for just about everything from high-tech industries like space or aviation through to universities and research institutions. By the way, anybody who's interested in state hacking activity should read this book. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, The Cyber Weapons Arm Race. It's written by the New York Times journalist Nicole Perbot, who you'll see here. I guarantee it'll make your hair stand on end. Of course, in the West, we mainly hear about the hacking exploits of only a handful of state actors, as they're known, the usual suspects, like Russia and China. Israel has been up with the leaders for many years. Just this week, the press has been full of stories about the Israeli company NSO and its Pegasus software that can completely take over any smartphone. On the other hand, we haven't heard much about what the US or the UK are up to since the Snowden revelations back in 2013. Anyway, many people are surprised to learn that there are now at least 100 states running offensive cyber operations. You'll find a lot more about that in a study called Cyber Capabilities and National Power, a Net Assessment, published last month by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I apologize, I'm having some network problems here, so the slides are not keeping up with what I'm saying. Here's the slide that refers to that. The point is that you don't have to be big, rich, and powerful to succeed in the cyber jungle. Just think back of all the teenagers that have hacked the US government, including the CIA and the FBI, over recent years. In the jargon, this is known as the asymmetrical threat. And if I can get the slide up, here is a definition of what that could mean. It means leveraging inferior tactical or operational strength against the vulnerabilities of a superior opponent to a disproportionate effect, and so on and so on. If you want an early example of an asymmetric conflict, you only have to go to the Bible and the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament. Think of David and Goliath, the nimble and lightly armed boy against the armored military monster. And unfortunately, we're not just talking about states stealing data or stealing secrets. As I mentioned earlier, digital technology is now central to every aspect of modern life. That means that state hackers can potentially access a whole new range of potential targets. An obvious example is the development of hacking techniques for sabotage, not just of military targets, but also of critical civilian infrastructure. An obvious example is what happened a few years ago in Ukraine in the context of its long-running dispute with its neighbor, Russia. Russian state hackers targeted Ukraine's power systems, destroying parts of the grid and causing blackouts that affected about 250,000 Ukrainians for up to 6 hours. This was the world's first successful mass cyber attack on an energy network, but it won't be the last. Over recent years, we've seen regular attempts to access the industrial control infrastructure of public utilities in other countries, including the US. Alongside sabotage, state hackers are also using psychological and subversive techniques that can achieve their political objectives without the use of force. Just think about attempts in recent years to mess with elections in the USA, France, and Ukraine. It's complicated trying to tackle this kind of activity because of two areas of uncertainty. Of course, there'll usually be an obvious suspect to blame, but it can be really difficult to know exactly where an attack is coming from in cyberspace. This, as I'm sure you know, is known as the problem of attribution. A second uncertainty comes from the fact that it's often really difficult to know how a victim should react in terms of international law. So let me give you an example from fiction. Let's say a massive cyber attack takes down the electricity network in Ruritania, a country that has a long history of conflict with its neighbor, Transylvania. Ruritania will immediately suspect that its old enemy, Transylvania, is responsible for the attack, but it can't be 100% sure. So how should it react? Should Ruritania regard that cyber attack on a critical asset as an act of war by Transylvania? Should it then take military action? If not, where should we draw the line? Back in the Cold War, the international community forced states to make agreements on what was legally unacceptable behavior. Those agreements helped save the world from nuclear destruction. When it comes to cyber conflict, the UN has been working quietly since 2003, when it set up an open-ended working group, so-called, to discuss threats to information security, as well as possible cooperative measures to address them. The final report of this group has just come out in March, and it's worth a skim if you're interested. After 18 years of work, the group has recommended 11 voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior, together with specific confidence building, capacity building, and cooperation measures. Of course, you're entitled to be skeptical when the only results of 18 years of talk are voluntary non-binding norms. But I suppose the answer to that is that the process is considerably better than nothing, particularly from the perspective of smaller states who may see themselves as powerless against the big cyber hitters. At least states are addressing some of the important basic issues at play. We may not yet have agreement on legal remedies, but we do have a consensus on the need to protect all critical infrastructures that support essential services to the public. Apart from the UN, there's also activity at the bilateral level. In 2015, Russia and China signed an extensive cybersecurity pact where they agreed not to hack each other, but instead to swap cyber threat data and to exchange information technology. So far, the US has not had any diplomatic success with Russia and China. In 2014, it froze a joint cyber working group with Russia because of Moscow's military action in Ukraine. And China pulled out of its own cyber working group with the Americans after the US Justice Department indicted 5 Chinese military members for hacking. That tactic of calling out state hackers, incidentally, has become a major tool for the US, which now routinely identifies state hackers, indicting them on criminal charges and subjecting them to sanctions. Just this week, we've seen the US and its allies formally naming Chinese state groups as responsible for a hack on Microsoft Exchange service worldwide earlier this year. The US is sending a message. We know who you are and where you work. Obviously, we don't know exactly what goes on at summits between the Chinese, Russian, and US presidents, but we do know that they regularly discuss the threats posed by hacking. Just last month, for example, President Biden held a press conference immediately after meeting with President Putin in Geneva. He said that he proposed that 16 US and Russian critical infrastructure, from the energy sector to water systems, should be completely off limits to attack by cyber or any other means. The US would take action if Russia continued to allow cyber criminals to operate with impunity in Russia. Finally, the two sides agreed to task their experts to work on specific understandings about what's off limits. They'd also follow up on specific cyber attacks that originate in either Russia or the US. Well, great, but progress in the real world still seems glacial, I think. In May, a Russian ransomware attack forced Colonial Pipeline to shut down around 5,500 miles of its network in the US. The company paid $5 million in ransom to its operations. Earlier this month, another Russia-based hacking group called Rebel claimed responsibility for a $70 million ransomware attack. Or perhaps something has changed. A few weeks after the Colonial Pipeline attack, US law enforcement managed to recover over $2 million in Bitcoin from the Russian hackers. And last week, websites on the dark web previously used by the rebel group stopped working. We don't know why, though it looks as though there was a planned concurrent takedown of the rebel infrastructure, either by the hackers themselves or through industry or perhaps law enforcement action. Was the Russian or US government involved, or did the group decide to relocate? We just don't know yet. So I've tried to explain how technology, psychology, and politics all combine to make cybersecurity really hard. Let me stop at this point.